Back when the earth was cooling, I did my doctoral dissertation on aspects of monastic spirituality. And what that substantively means is that I know a great deal more than almost anyone you will ever meet about an extremely narrow topic which no sane person wants to know anything about at all. But if you hang around Catholics or mystics or other flavors of spiritual folks, you will hear names of books and people like the Desert Fathers, the Rule of St. Benedict, the Cloud of Unknowing, the Imitation of Christ, and such people as St. Teresa of Avila, the Little Flower, and St. Bonaventure, and the guy whose work became seminal for me in my dissertation, the Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. I dare say that I'm the only person that you will ever know who not only has actually studied, let alone read, all of these spiritual classics, and if that impresses you, I'll sign autographs at the end of the service today. There's obviously a great deal about this body of spiritual literature that drew me in, but I wouldn't have spent that kind of time on it if I didn't find good things in it. But none of these works are popular in the modern era because almost all of them also promoted a certain spiritual narcissism that expresses itself and possibly even in a full-blown case of mental illness, that the kind of spirituality it advocates for is something that I think would make all of us uncomfortable today. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church, wrote his exercises to be used as a manual for a 4-week-long silent retreat. And he writes in the introduction, "We are created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord, and by this means to save our souls." Ignatius describes an entirely self-centered spirituality in which he encourages his monastic brothers to be so afraid of going to hell that they will not even consider committing even the most venial of sins. In one of the early exercises, he tells them to come to think of themselves. Now, mind you, you're in a month-long silent retreat, and he's telling you to sit alone and imagine yourself as a sore and an abscess from whence nothing can come but many sins, so much evil, and the most vile poison. Yeah. Now, it's a paradox that Ignatius wants us to both destroy our ego, but to do it for purely egotistical goals, which is to avoid the fires of hell and to attain to heaven. One gets the impression that if Ignatius became convinced that there were no heaven or hell, that he might become quite a cavalier, because it's really all about him. And in fact, prior to getting shot in the leg by a cannonball, he was quite a cavalier. He found a conversion in his desire to attain to heaven. Now, granted, Ignatius may represent the extreme, but as such, I think he serves as a very good illustration of what I mean when I divide the religious world into two groups. There is the religion of Ignatius and his ilk, which may feel deeply, may feel passionately, but their feelings are all basically self-serving. And there is a kind of spirituality, on the other hand, the hallmark of which is empathy towards others. Now, this really came together for me the first time I had to teach a college class, which was a course on the life and teachings of Jesus. And one of our textbooks back in the fall of 1994 was the newly published book by Marcus Borg, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. And it was there that I encountered the description of Jesus not as a dying and rising Savior or as the exalted Son of God, but Borg described him as being the teacher of compassion. Looking behind the assumptions of the gospel parables, the miracle accounts, the sermons, a historical Jesus emerged whose primary focus was in teaching people to show empathy. Now, either I was too young to see this when I was in grad school, or the more scholarly books that we used in grad school hid this very basic insight from me, but it wasn't until I had to teach it that my preaching, I've been preaching for 15 years, but it wasn't until I had to teach it in a classroom that all this started to make sense to me. The religion of Ignatius, and for that matter, most of what passes for Christianity, for Islam, for Judaism, is fundamentally self-centered. Piety, devotion, worship, prayer, sacraments. Really, the assumption behind these things is typically a kind of divine fire insurance to keep a fundamentally psychopathic God off of our backs, so that we might be able to slip through the pearly gates and get to be as self-indulgent as we always wanted to be in our mortal lives, but to get to do it for eternity. The historical Jesus was not interested in saving souls. He was trying to open our eyes. And in that sense, he's not at all unlike the Buddha or probably Zoroaster. I find the common Christian nomenclature of being saved to be both intellectually and spiritually insulting. And by the way, I've been saved, or I got saved, or have you been saved? The word saved, the past tense of salvation, does not appear anywhere in the Bible. It's not in the Old Testament. It's not in the New Testament. It is a part of American revival language, but it's not a part of ancient theology. Salvation in the New Testament was always a process of those who were being saved. And what that means is they were being changed. They were being transformed. We've presented it as, again, the golden ticket to heaven. That's not at all even a biblical idea, not that I'm afraid to disagree with portions of the Bible. But you dismiss the notion of being saved, and you hear, at least the way the Buddha is popularly described as his self-description, as saying that he is one who is awake. And I think that resonates with what I think we really mean by the spiritual journey of salvation, whatever, is a matter of literally getting the scales off your eyes and becoming aware, becoming mindful, and becoming compassionate. Our spiritual practices of just coming here every week, whether you participate in sacraments or prayers or rituals, is ultimately we are engaging in a concerted practice of trying to become our full and awake selves. The religion of these great spiritual classics that I referred to, and sadly most of mainstream religions, promotes piety, but not goodness. You see the difference? That you can be very pious and still be totally worthless. They teach people to avoid the sins of sexual immorality, of gluttony, of drunkenness, greed, and vanity. But a person can be personally sinless and be of no practical use whatsoever. Think of someone you know who never smokes, drinks, cusses, uses drugs, steals, hoards, or messes around. Would you invite that person to your house for dinner? Really? Or more importantly, would you share your most painful and embarrassing personal challenges with them? Piety is an exercise of the pious. It may leave them untarnished by the world, but it also makes them totally useless. What Paul Gilbert is writing about in Mindful Compassion is that the human being is the one animal that is capable, if they try, of feeling empathy. Now, I don't want to rile any of you dog or cat lovers in the audience. Your pet can feel sympathy. Your dog or your cat may not know why you're sad or why you're sick, but they can often sense that you are in pain, and they will show sympathy to you. Empathy is different, not only because there's an element of understanding, but because there is also an element of anticipation. that you can, if you are empathic, you can predict how someone will feel in a given situation. For example, recently, Sean needed to use the church to rehearse an opera that they were doing that was sort of a spoof on Wine Lovers. What was the name of the opera, Sean? Wine Lovers Musical. And Sean recognized that the AA group was going to be meeting here at a time that he was planning to rehearse. And he changed his plans because he was afraid that some of these recovering alcoholics, hearing them sing jokes and celebrating their intoxication, that might cause one of them to consider losing their sobriety. Now that's empathy, to anticipate how just rehearsing those songs here might affect the guys in the narthex and cause them pain. So he corrected his own actions. Now this is not the biggest deal in the world. Sean was under a time crunch. He needed the rehearsal time. He needed the rehearsal space. Our AA group is very small, and if one of those guys heard funny songs about getting drunk and decided to leave the building and go get drunk, that would not have been Sean's fault. And it wasn't because Sean knows anyone in the AA group. It's not because Sean is in recovery, but because he was able to anticipate that rehearsing at that time might have created a problem for a total stranger. Even here in our building where we have every right to do whatever we need to do to get our work done, but he decided to inconvenience the cast of an opera in order to protect the AA meeting. Now again, not the biggest deal in the world, but it's an example of not only being able to sympathize with the plight of people who are trying to manage a potentially lethal addiction, but being willing to inconvenience himself and the other members of the opera cast in order to avoid problems. I'm not saying that your dog doesn't miss you when you're away, or that your cat doesn't stay by your side when you're sick, but empathy is a bit different. It is the ability to anticipate suffering. However, all humans don't appear to possess this capacity. I think it's the mark of real spirituality, and it's what separates the spiritual from the merely religious. Let me give you a contrasting illustration. Yesterday, there were thousands of Central Americans who were fleeing gang and government violence, trying to make their way to the border of the United States in order to find work. Our president threatened to cut off $24 million of aid to Mexico if the Mexican government allowed all of these people to cross that bridge from Guatemala into Mexico. So they're trapped on that bridge. They're still there this morning. And I want to draw your attention to this part of that photograph just off to the side from the bridge, the number of little boats there in the river, and these guys are ferrying people across the river for 50 cents. So all of these people you saw lined up on this bridge are there because they can't afford 50 cents to get a boat ride across the river. That's how poor and how desperate these people are. In defending his refusal to allow these refugees to seek safety in the USA, President Trump said, "These are not babies, these are hardened criminals." The problem with that is, of course, they are babies, and mothers with children in their arms and on their backs, mothers who don't have 50 cents to get a boat ride for their children across the river, mothers who've already walked for weeks and who plan to walk for weeks more in the hopes of saving their children from violence, rape, and starvation. Once they are across the bridge that is right here, they still have 1,400 miles to walk to get to the southern border of the United States, where, when they get there, they will be apprehended, their children will be put in cages, and the mothers will be put into detention. After a 3-month march through the tropics, This woman will be put in detention and her children will be put in cages on your behalf by your government using your tax dollars. Now, how does that feel? Gilbert is arguing that the combination of the practices of mindfulness and compassion make us capable of being empathetic. We can literally anticipate what these people will feel in a few weeks after they've walked those 1,400 miles to get to the border of Texas. But in the world of psychology, there's a lot of professional conversation about people who are not capable of feeling empathy. It's a trait that we see in narcissists, but it's also a part of the diagnosis of a psychopath or a sociopath, and in some forms of autism. While it's common professional practice to avoid diagnosing someone that you haven't actually had in a counseling relationship, still, I think we've heard enough public dialogue from our president to see that he simply does not appear to feel empathy. He can look at those thousands of people on that bridge and state what is clearly not true, claiming that they are hardened criminals. Now, he certainly appears to be narcissistic, but I believe that I could make a pretty good professional case for him being a psychopath. And he is the President of the United States of America. Now, I hope you know that I'm not just being political. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has written an entire book warning us that Trump is taking us in the direction of fascism. Noam Chomsky, easily the smartest man in the world, has said that the Republican Party has become the most dangerous organization in the history of the world. Berkeley professor and former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich is weekly producing videos, and if you're not watching them, you can subscribe to them. They're excellent. But he is week after week warning the public about the tax scams and disastrous but self-serving economic policies of the Trump administration. And Michael Moore, who's no Noam Chomsky, but Michael Moore's a pretty good fella, he has built a strong case for how Trump's policies are leading in the direction of the extinction of the human race. Now, I would not use this pulpit for partisan purposes. It's not about being Republican or Democrat. It's not about being conservative or liberal. What I'm talking about goes far beyond politics. But as it directly concerns empathy, let me mention this horrible story we've learned of this week of the unspeakably cruel torture, murder, and dismemberment of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Trump's initial reaction was to observe that Khashoggi was not a citizen of the United States. He was a resident, but he wasn't a citizen, as if somehow that gives you permission to not care. The Saudi government has, he says, pledged to buy over $100 billion in military hardware. That's a grossly inflated number. It's not true. They will never spend that kind of money. But still, he's making it plain that in the choice between sincere empathy for this man and his family and loved ones or cash, that he makes a flat-footed decision for cash. Now, that doesn't surprise anybody here. And maybe no one here will be shocked by any stupid thing that televangelist Pat Robertson says. But a co-host on his TV show was trying to lead him into expressing shock and offense by the murder of Khashoggi, and Pat Robertson insisted on taking Trump's position that you cannot afford to not maintain the sales contract for military hardware going to Saudi Arabia, which is being used in an illegal war in Yemen. And we are actively participating in their war in Yemen. We are putting up the planes that refuel their bombers that are dropping bombs on civilian populations in Yemen on your behalf by your government with your money. Now, religion without empathy does not, in my estimation, deserve to be considered a religion. I'll wait until I hear an enthusiastic amen.
Amen.
Thank you. I feel so lonely up here sometimes. Religion without empathy is really just enlightened self-interest. I accept that it's impolite and probably unethical to criticize another person's religion, but I'm just saying they've got to have a religion first before they deserve that kind of respect. People whose faith is not defined by empathy, I'm saying, are not members of the religion club, and I don't feel any obligation to treat them with kid gloves. The ancient Greeks had a proverb. They said, "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they will never sit." Ignatius was just wrong. The purpose of our lives is not to live in such a way that we avoid hell and manage to get into heaven. Come on, that's not just self-centered and narcissistic, it's pathetically stupid. The real purpose of life is to be a blessing to other people, to alleviate suffering, to make the world more safe, more just, more fair, and dare I say it, more loving and more happy. Would that be so wrong? Thanks. I want churches and synagogues and temples and mosques to raise generations of people whose faith is defined by the practice of empathy, so that when you get people like Sean who can anticipate how an alcoholic recovering from his addiction might feel if you sing a particular song. And when you've done that for years and you get a job on the border patrol on the southern border of the United States and your boss tells you to take infants and children and lock them into cages, you can tell your boss, you say it then. Go to hell. Absolutely. Or if your boss happens to be the prince of Saudi Arabia and he tells you to torture, kill, and dismember a journalist, you just don't do it. There is a way to be a Muslim with great moral integrity. There's a way to be a Jew or a Buddhist or a Christian with great moral integrity. You just can't be any of those things without empathy. Now that's just my opinion. Just so happens I'm right.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.